In this tutorial, we're going to highlight the features of the Vector Texture tool, which is able to create patterns ranging from abstract wavy textures to those that could be used for a faux wood grain effect. This presentation naturally follows into several toolpathing tutorials that can be accessed through the related videos. Now, I already have a vector texture displayed on the screen, but for the purpose of this presentation, I will start from a new part. So under File, New, and this is going to be a single-sided job. It's going to be a width of 24 inches, a height of 12, a thickness of 3/4 of an inch. Our Z0 position will be from the material surface, and our XY data position will be the lower left-hand corner. So with that now, I have my rectangular job space, and I need to bring a vector texture into this area. So from my drawing menu, I'm going to go to the Create Vectors area where we've got a number of different shapes that we can create, and one of those is the vector texture. So with that, as I click on that, it will open up a new form with a number of different parameters that will affect the texture. Now, before we look at these parameters, I'm just going to show you with a preview of exactly what we had before. And now I'm going to come up and just reset these values, and we're going to gradually work through them, showing how they change the texture. So I'm just going to change these parameters and preview that now, and we've got a very simple texture shown on the screen. So it remains highlighted in purple until we hit OK. So essentially, every time I'm previewing, I'm modifying that item, and then OK will actually create that item. So if we look at the very top of the screen, we have angle set, currently set at 0 degrees. You can see that natural wave is flowing from left to right parallel to the x-axis because we don't have any angle. I can add an angle to it, so in this case I'm going to add 30 on the keyboard and preview that. And now that's running at 30 degrees, or I could use the slider underneath and once again change the angle. But I'm going to put this back now to 0 degrees, and we'll go to the next area, which is line spacing. So with that, we currently have a line spacing of 1 inch. And what do we mean by that? That's the distance between the two peaks vertically or two troughs. Okay, you will get a slight variation in the side pieces, but essentially the max spacing will never be greater than 1 inch. If I lower that down to say 0.5 or increase that to 2, you can see that we get an instant update of the vectors on the screen. So I'm going to reduce this down, say 0.5. And what I can do now underneath that is allow a variation. You'll see as I increase this now, what we are getting is a difference in the maximum spacing. So we have basically lines that run parallel to each other, but the spacing is different. Now, if I increase this up to say 2 inches, okay, you can start to see there that we've got some with a very large spacing up to 2 inches, some smaller, right the way down to maybe ½ an inch there. Okay, so it can create a nice random effect pattern, and you have that with the slider underneath, which will change the amount of spacing from low up to high. Okay, so with that now, I'm just going to set this back down to 1 and move this back down to everything being perfectly parallel, which we can see on the screen. And now I'm going to move down to wave parameters. And we're going to start by looking at amplitude. And what do we mean by amplitude? It's the distance between the peak and the trough, the vertical distance between those two. So in this case, it's set to 1. So I can actually go ahead and measure this using the measure tool. So under Edit Objects, I can go to the measure tool, and I'm just going to pick just somewhere roughly on the top and then somewhere down to the peak, to the trough. And we can see that Y distance is being 0.9998, i.e. 1 inch. So that's showing that the amplitude is set to 1 inch. So I'm going to close that down now. And this also shows the ability for me to select the texture and then come back into the tool to do further modifications. So I'm going to reopen the tool, and I can come straight back in now and modify the amplitude, change that down to say 0.5. Okay, we can see we've got a much more subtle wave now, or I could increase that, say up to 2 inches, and we've got a much more accentuated wave. Okay, and once again, you can do this through the slider too. I'm going to set this back down to 1 inch, and we're going to come down to look at wavelength. Now, wavelength is the distance between two peaks or two troughs, and it will affect the number of waves we're going to get across the screen. So in this case we've got 6 inches set, so on our 24-inch part we will essentially get 4 waves, and we can see that we've got on the left hand side there, we are at the trough of 1, to the next trough is 6 inches, to the next trough that's 12 inches, to the next trough is 18 inches, and then across to the end is 24 inches. So essentially we have 4 waves because each wavelength is set to 6 inches on this 24-inch part. And we can lower it from 6 down to 2 and preview, and therefore we now have 12 wavelengths across our part. I can increase that up to 18 and preview, and that gives me 1 1/3, and I can even go greater than the width of the material. So the width is 24, let's go up to 32 and preview, and you've got essentially 2/3 of a wave on the screen. Okay, so I'm going to put this back down now to 6 and preview, which is the standard shape that we had, and move down to noise. Okay, so noise here is essentially adding a little bit of turbulence to the wave. We've got a nice smooth vector across the screen, and you'll notice as I increase the noise, we can see we get a much more jagged wave across the screen. And of course the amount of deviation depends on the maximum spacing we've got at the top of the screen. So with the higher the spacing, the greater the noise that we have. So I'm going to increase this right up now, and you can see that we've got considerable noise based on the fact that we're using quite a large spacing. If I reduce the spacing down to say 0.25 and preview, you can see the level of noise is less because it's only got a shorter distance in which to create that noise over. Okay, so that gives us an idea of the different parameters that we can modify in order to create our vector. Now the following one is to place vectors on a layer. In this case this is not ticked, therefore when I preview that, it's essentially going to be placed onto our active layer, which we look at the top of the screen is layer 1. So if I OK that, we can now see that, and we can come up to the top. We've just got one layer and our vector is drawn on that layer. What I can do is come back now and select that vector, come back into the tool, okay, and place that vector on a new layer. In this case I'm going to call this textures, and preview that and OK. And if we go up to our layers, we can see that we have 2 layers now, layer 1 and layer textures. Layer textures is the active layer and does have the texture placed on it, and layer 1 has no material on it whatsoever. We can see that by switching that on and off. So we've created the new texture which has been placed onto the layer texture. Okay, so the next stage is for us to look at how we can define the region into which we can place the texture. So I'm going to take the texture we see on the screen and just delete that out the way, and then come back to our Create Vectors menu here and select, in this case, a polygon. Now I'm just going to quickly just plonk this in the middle of the screen and stretch this out so we've got a polygon shape, and close out that form. So we've got a single vector there, and I would like that to define the region as to where I'm going to place the texture. So I have this highlighted, I come back into the form now and simply hit preview, and we can see that that texture has been applied just to within that vector, and in this case it's been placed on the textures layer. If I OK that, we can see that has been committed now, and we come up to our menu, it's been added to the texture area as you can see on the screen. Okay, so that's an easy way for us to be able to define the region into which we want to apply the texture by selecting a vector first and then coming into the form. Okay, so now that we've explored all the different parameters that can be used to create a texture, we ought to really think about how we're going to apply them in the real world. Now in this particular case I want to create a large textured wall panel, but unfortunately I have a small machine that cannot accept large material. Therefore I need to piece this together in separate chunks in order to create the larger piece once it's on the wall. So how would I go about doing this? Really, there's two different ways. One is to make sure I create a tileable texture in the first place, so each single panel can be basically matched side by side, top and bottom, in order to create a completed texture on the wall. Or the other one is to create the large scale texture in its entirety, in other words full size if it was going to be on the wall, and then use the toolpath tiling to divide that up into separate pieces that would then bring it together. But in this case we're going to be using we're going to make sure we create a tileable texture. So with that, I'm just going to simply delete out the vector that we have on the screen and the border and come back to the menu, and I'm going to immediately put this back to our original parameters, which were 1, 1 and 6. We're going to reduce the noise down. I'm not going to put the vectors on a layer, and we're going to preview. I'm happy with that, so I'm going to OK the form to commit them onto the screen, and let's take a look at what we have here. We can clearly see that we have 4 different waves running across the screen from left to right, and it looks like the left hand edge will match the right hand edge, and we can see it looks like our 4 sort of little crests at the bottom of the screen will sit quite nicely on the top. So it looks like we do have a tileable texture here, but the best way to find out is just to zoom out and to copy the textures. So I'm just going to zoom out now and place this in the lower left hand corner, and we're going to look at picking up the vectors and copying it into position. Okay, so with this I'm just going to select all the vectors there, and I'm going to right mouse key copy and right mouse key paste, and then simply pick one of them up. So I'm going to hold it on that left hand key there, move it across, and then just drop that onto the relevant position, which should be there. Okay, we can clearly see it matches in that case. And now I'm going to do the same and take both tiles and copy them up to the top. Once again, copy and paste, and I'm simply going to take the bottom point there, so I'm going to take that point there and wrap that straight onto that top position there, and we can clearly see now we have 4 tiles that look like it is one tile, so clearly that was a tileable texture. Okay, so now that we've established we can create a tileable texture, we can go ahead and look to create 4 new textures that we'll look to create toolpaths for in later presentations. So with that, I'm going to delete these vectors we have on the screen now. So I'm going to select them all and hit delete. And I'm just going to go to a full screen view and come up to my layers, and I have 2 there, layer 1 and layer textures. I'm going to delete out the layer textures. So with that, I'm going to hit delete now. And what we have on the screen is our job piece of 24 by 12. Now, when we're going to create our new vectors, we need to be aware of how we're going to create these panels. Now, at the moment, I want my panel to be 24 by 12. But what I want to make sure is that my tool actually runs past the border, and then we can trim the border back using a profile toolpath. So essentially I want my texture to be bigger in X and Y, and then to profile around the edge of a vector in order to trim that up to the 24 by 12. Okay, so with that I'm going to come back up to the form now for the set job dimensions and origin, and increase this to 25 in X and 13 in Y. Okay, and essentially what we're going to do is now create a vector and place that in the middle, so we will have an extra ½ inch in all 4 regions. So with that, I'm going to come back up to the draw rectangle, and I'm just going to quickly create this as 24 in X, 12 in Y, and just create that on the screen. Clearly that's not in the center, so I'm going to close out the form now, select this, come up to the Align Objects menu, and just position that in the center of the workspace. So what we have now is we have a workpiece that is 25 by 13 and a vector placed in the center that is 24 by 12. Okay, so we're now ready to move forward and start creating our first texture. So we're going to come up to the vector texture tool and open the form, and we can immediately see here that we need to modify some of our parameters for our first one, which is essentially going to be a wave pattern. So with that, we're going to keep 0 degrees as our angle. Our spacing is going to be decreased from 1 to 0.3. Our amplitude is going to stay at 1 and our wavelength is 6. We'll keep the noise low, so we're just going to create a nice wave texture. So I'm going to actually place this on a layer called wave, preview that, and as you can see it's going past our border, it's going right up to the edge of our workspace, and I will OK that. So that's created that texture now. If we have a look at our menu there, we can see it's been placed on wave. Okay, and I'm going to leave that switched off now, and I'm going to activate layer 1. And whilst I'm there, I'm going to rename this. I'm going to rename this and call this cutout, because that is what it will be used for when we get to machining later on. So that's now an active layer. You can see that at the top it's active, and I can come back into the tool now and think about creating number 2 texture. So I'm going to pop the form open now, and I'm going to change the angle here to 45, and our maximum spacing is going to increase from 0.3 to 0.35. Our amplitude will go up by another ½ an inch to 1.5, but we will leave the wavelength at 6, and this is going to be called step, and you'll see why when I preview. And you can see the sort of wave steps up the screen, so it's like a rounded step formation. I'm going to OK that now to commit that onto the screen. We can see that being drawn and undrawn there, so I'm going to just draw it off and reselect my cutout, and then come back to my vector texture form in order to create the 3rd texture. Okay, in this case we're going to increase the angle right the way up to 60 degrees, and we're going to just slightly increase the spacing to 0.4, and we're going to increase our variation roughly up to around about sort of 60%. The amplitude is going to be massively increased to 8, and our wavelength up to 16. Okay, so we're going to increase that to 16, and this one is actually going to be called a swirl, and you'll see why. And we're going to preview that, and we can see that we've got this nice, quite radical swirly pattern across our screen. So with that, I'm going to commit that now with the OK and come up to the form, and we can see that we've added in that extra swirl. I'm going to switch that off and reselect my cutout, and once again come back to the final texture. So I'm going to open the form now, and in this case we're going to go for a very small angle. This is the one we're going to create for the wood grain, so we're just going to have just a very slight angle on this, and our line spacing is going to be just 0.15, so we're just going to use 0.15. Our amplitude is going to be set to just 0.1, so a really small amplitude on this. Our variation, I'm happy with it at 60%, and our wavelength is going to be massively increased to 18. Okay, so essentially it's going to just be a very wide wavelength with a very small amplitude, but one of the key aspects is to switch the noise up. So we're going to switch the noise roughly to about sort of 40% there, and this is going to be called wood grain. And we'll preview that, and there we can see our wood grain effect. And of course we will see the effect of this when we look to create the toolpathing for this later in a presentation. Okay, so before we actually save this part and look forward to the toolpathing in later presentations, let's take a closer look at the sort of nodes, the points that are on these curves. So with that, I'm now just going to switch off and switch on, in this case, the wave toolpath we see on the screen here, and take a closer look. So if I select it, it selects as a single entity, and of course I can come back to the form and open it, but maybe I want to start modifying these points. Okay, in which case I now need to essentially ungroup the object. So I can ungroup the object back onto the original object layers or onto the group layers. Okay, so with that I need to make sure that my wave is the active layer. Okay, so I'm going to come back in now and right mouse key and say ungroup onto groups layer, so that's going to put it onto the wave. Okay, so we can see that now, and you can see I now have individual vectors. Okay, so what that allows me to do is potentially modify these, but of course I can only modify them if there's a rational set of points on the curve. So in order to see those points, I can hit N on the keyboard, which will show the nodes, and as you can see, we can see essentially what looks like a long black line, but if we zoom in now, you can see that we have lots and lots of single straight lines. Okay, so in some cases it may be better to rationalize this for machining, but essentially with toolpathing, the toolpath will be a series of straight lines anyway, so it shouldn't really affect the machining. But what we do need to do is, if we want to start modifying, like moving points, you can see I can move single points there, but of course I would have to move lots of points. It would be very, very difficult to do. So with that, I now need to potentially sort of rationalize the curve. In other words, limit the number of points on there so we can make some fairly drastic changes. So with that, now we have on the Edit Objects menu the curve fitting command. So if I select this option now, it will bring up a form with the fitting type of what we want to fit to this. So whether we want to fit circular arcs, Bezier curves, or straight lines. Of course we have straight lines in this case. The tolerance, so this is the tolerance which I'm allowing the curve to be modified in the curve fitting algorithm. So in this case I might specify, say, 2 thou, and I want to keep any sharp corners if there were sharp corners, but there isn't in this case. And I'm going to put Bezier curves in there, and I'm going to preview that. And as you can see, we've dramatically reduced the number of points on that curve. So I've previewed that, and now I'm going to OK that, and we can come into that curve whilst it's still selected, hit N on the keyboard, and as you can see, we've dramatically reduced the number of points, which then allows me to make some modifications which affect the curve in a much different way to moving those individual node points that we had on the previous curve. This is quite handy if you want to add in some variable spacing, okay, even within single vectors. Okay, so that's just to show you that we can, if required, modify those curves in order to make later modifications for machining. So I'm just going to put this back now to its original location, and we're now going to look to head now to save this part. So I can come up to the top now and do File, Save As, and we're going to save this as our Vector Textures vectordrawing.crv file and save that for a later presentation.